Good morning, everybody. Everyone doing okay out there? Very good. Okay, I'm Scott Stern, and I think actually since I have a mic, I can just do this. Great. I'm really delighted to be here for a variety of reasons, not least of which is to see some old friends and separately to meet some new ones, but also this is the first time I've actually been back in the Marriott and presenting in this room in 2 years, so it's a delight to be here. So welcome to MIT. Thank you for joining. And I'm just going to spend a little time kind of really providing a little bit of the lessons that we've gained from the MIT Regional Entrepreneurship Acceleration Program over the last decade, and some of the lessons from that, both its inception in thinking about Kendall, that came from thinking about Kendall Square, and also the lessons that we've gained in that program for how you might engage with MIT and with the Kendall Square ecosystem. Let's see if this is going to work. Oh, very excellent. So Carl went over this, a similar picture, but I will say this is a picture from about 1973 of where you now are currently sitting, and it has a little bit more green space. That's for sure true. I'm pretty sure you definitely don't want to swim in the river. I can guarantee you that. But it was a bit of a challenging time. People basically had given up. And here we are now. And that's a transformation that I think has brought some of you here today, that brings people all over the world to visit within this ecosystem, to see how to engage it, and very often to bring some of those lessons back home to their own ecosystems, both through their companies as well as the regions that they serve. Just to be clear, this picture shows a lot of buildings. The question is what, and I'm going to talk about sort of two eras. There was one era where what happened was a small number of key companies, some in biotech, as was mentioned, others in places like software, think of Lotus, really kind of started to carve out this system and kind of be kind of isolates. But then over the past, I'd say 15 years, what you've seen is just this wave of companies, this kind of continuing stream of innovative companies just populate different spaces. And I'll talk about whether or not it's the Startup Exchange, whether or not it's things at the Cambridge Innovation Center, the CIC. I think you're going to be hearing from Tim Rowe later today, whether or not it's Mass Challenge that got started here and moved across the river. There's just this kind of wave of activity that has occurred. And the question is kind of how to engage with that and what lessons to draw from it. And here's our colleague across the river at the Harvard Business School, Josh Lerner. About a decade ago, he wrote a book. He had kind of looked at efforts in this type, basically to stimulate entrepreneurship, to engage with entrepreneurs. And Josh is I love him to death, but he's a pretty grumpy guy. And he titles his book, The Boulevard of Broken Dreams. And I highly recommend you read it, but I can guarantee you that's the tone, okay? It's a really kind of depressing read. And in particular, what he pointed out was that most efforts to engage with entrepreneurs, to engage ecosystems, are quite well-intentioned. They're just not very successful. And that really posed a challenge to us. We saw things occurring here. We were doing research about some ecosystems around the world. And the question was kind of, what could we draw about what's really driving the successes and what makes it less likely to have a more productive engagement and acceleration strategy? Essentially, how can we accelerate and engage innovation-driven entrepreneurial ecosystems? And that was really what led to the founding a little bit more than a decade ago, with great support from ILP and others, of the Regional Entrepreneurship Acceleration Program. And there's I'm just one faculty member within it. We have a great group of faculty and staff. I know that Phil Button is here, from whom I stole some slides for this presentation. So thank you, Phil, all part of the team in the shared Dropbox, right? And there's up there is Fiona Murray, my co-founder and director of the program. And I just wanted to say she's also the co-director of the MIT Innovation Initiative, and I think really impactful around campus. We've been really privileged now. We started, I can guarantee you, if you were in cohort 1 of REAP, it was a little bit of a shoestring operation, but we've been now really privileged to work with more than 60 regions around the world, each of those regions in a 2-year program of stakeholder engagement, that really kind of moves forward their own regional ecosystem. And the question is, what do we do in REAP? People are like, what is REAP? Why is it different than many other things? And it's something that we kind of really looked within our own ecosystem here, drew lessons, saw what was working and not in terms of engagement, and then kind of translated those lessons more broadly. And specifically, there are kind of 3 big buckets about what REAP is about. The first of those is the role of stakeholders. That, and I'm going to talk more about this, but that engaging in an ecosystem is a hard thing because you're moving beyond your usual organizational boundary, your usual line of command. You're having to take some risks, and that requires some trust, requires some relationships, requires some time and effort, requires some resources. But if we all get together as stakeholders and we just chat, but maybe we're kind of talking past each other. Very often we come from a very different perspective, particularly in terms of understanding innovation, entrepreneurship, growth. And so we really have to understand the system. Right? We can be very analytical. This is MIT. We don't shy away from that, to be analytical about things. And really, what is really driving these ecosystems more structurally? But of course, if we just got people together and we just did some research around the system, that would be, let me be clear, I'm an academic, I'm an economist. I could write some papers in journals that no one's ever read, and we'd all kind of go home pretty happy. But that doesn't really live up to MIT's mission of mense manus, mind meets hand from idea to impact. And that occurs through action, through strategy. Let me just I'm going to kind of go through each of those, and then we're going to see that impact, kind of visualize it in a real way. And Randall, where's Randall? Just kind of tell me when I have about 5 minutes left, if that's okay. So the first part, as you start to engage with this innovation-driven entrepreneurial ecosystem here at MIT, is to take one lesson. No one is in charge of entrepreneurship. Let me repeat that. No one is in charge of entrepreneurship. And that one insight leads to a lot of other things. Let me be clear. I was teaching till with the students there, so literally I was here till about 11 p.m. last night with students in a doctoral class. And let me be clear, in my doctoral class, I basically teach what I want. I think it's a useful thing. I co-teach with another faculty member. We occasionally fight about what we teach, but we're basically in charge of our classroom, the first approximation. Right? As faculty members, we get to choose what to present to students, what we think will develop them to be great researchers. That's a little different than engaging with an entrepreneurial ecosystem. Entrepreneurs at the top of this are required, and they do the actions to grow their companies. But their ability to succeed, to realize their ideas, and Carl already kind of hinted at this, depends on engaging with various other players who might choose to engage or not. University, think MIT. Government, sometimes a dirty word. Many of you here from the corporate sector, what role do those startups play? And risk capital, right? Either in the form of venture, angel, or other forms of venture financing. Just to kind of give a sort of sense of this, and this starts to build on some of the work that Phil Button, a faculty member at Sloan, who has a background in history, has sort of taught me is if you actually look back in the day, kind of very early on in the IT revolution, Boston and Silicon Valley were sort of on a par. I'm a Stanford grad, so I like Silicon Valley. But then actually there was a big period where Boston really didn't get its act together. Kendall Square kind of wasn't yet formed. A lot of the work was out in Route 128 in individual companies. Think of DEC, right? Places like that, Wang Computing. And that leadership was ceded in that area for certainly that era to Silicon Valley. But interestingly, while some people kind of wrote off Boston at that time, a very different story occurred in the formulation of what became the leading biotech cluster in the world. And it's interesting, if you kind of look at what caused that cluster to emerge, it wasn't any one thing. There were some things that could have vetoed it. If the city of Cambridge had gone through with its plan to literally ban all genetics research in the city of Cambridge, that probably would have put a little bit of a damper on the plan. Carl's been here just long enough that he probably remembers that, right? Right? What was the name of the city council person who, sorry, right? Either way, right? But some of these things are university, right? The Whitehead or the Broad Institute. Some of them are obviously individual companies, whether that's a Biogen, Takeda, right? Millennium, Sanofi Genzyme. Some of them are kind of these weird hybrids like Lab Central. Many of you will have not heard. That is a space that startups can use to get access to expensive biologics equipment that there's no way they could afford as an individual startup. But because there's this dense cluster here, everyone can get access to the latest and greatest equipment that you would really need like millions of dollars for, and they do it on a kind of per rental basis. Right? You have new forms of venture financing. Right? So you all know Moderna, right? Probably about half of you or a third of you are sitting here because of Moderna, right? Literally sitting in this room based on vaccine, right? Well, Moderna was actually a spin out from Flagship Ventures. A very different form of risk capital founded by Nubar Fayan, who used to be a senior lecturer at the Sloan School. Right? And kind of, and so just to be clear, that's just to kind of give a sort of sense of this idea that no one is in charge of entrepreneurship. Every single stakeholder plays a critical role. And so if you take anything away from today, don't ask, what am I going to get from working with ILP? That's actually the wrong question. If you start there, you will end up in a kind of narrow view. You're going to be saying, oh, I need this. Start with, what role will I play in this ecosystem? What value will I bring? Where can I add value? And how does the adding of value to this ecosystem through ILP, through engagement with MIT, through engagement with Startup Exchange, how is then that going to ultimately be beneficial for the organization that I represent, whether it's startup, corporate, or region? To do that, it is useful to kind of sit down. I'm not, in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, on really kind of digging into what makes up for an entrepreneurial ecosystem. Let me just, right? And we kind of, within REAP, we sort of try to talk about a few core drivers that lead to the performance of an ecosystem. In particular, we sort of try to highlight the distinctive and complementary roles, but separate, distinct roles of innovative capacity, ICAP, and entrepreneurial capacity, ECAP. Innovation is the ability to bring ideas to scale, to sort of create new ideas and bring them to scale. Entrepreneurial capacity is the ability to found new organizations and bring those to scale. And sometimes that occurs in the same organization with a given idea, but sometimes those things are separate. Right? We can think of a place like Korea has a very high level of innovative capacity, maybe a lower level of entrepreneurial capacity. New Zealand builds a lot of companies, but not very innovative. I mean, I love New Zealand. If there's any New Zealanders here, go Kiwis, okay? What's distinctive about the 1 square mile that you now stand in is it is one of the few places, and certainly maybe the most dense place in terms of a walkable area that you can really bring people in, get around, and really engage multiple people in the course of a day, that is both mixing a very high level of innovative capacity with a high level of entrepreneurial capacity. It's not luck that these firms emerge here. It is the result of the process. Right? Just trying to go back to that biotech example, you really see the investment that led to the biotech revolution being centered here in a small number of other places, despite many people trying to get into that game in a very big way. Right? That kind of gets reflected in some of the kind of cluster-based kind of comparative advantage of the region, and then that kind of allows you to sort of think about kind of the different pieces and the different elements of our ecosystem as kind of what are the areas of specialty comparative advantage, and how does that filter the enormous talent that we bring in terms of innovation, mostly in our students, certainly, right? And the initiative and the rigor that we bring to the process of starting and scaling startups through entrepreneurship. Of course, all of that doesn't sort of change your day-to-day. It's maybe interesting academically without turning it into action, into strategy. And through the REAP program, one of the things we talk about is that we go deep on what we mean. We sort of say, actually, there's no one-size-fits-all, but there are a few things to avoid, and there are a range of things that have been assembled both within this ecosystem as well as many of the other examples that we've seen across the world that let us think about the kind of impact of different strategic interventions and the relationship among those interventions, the relationship between programs. So I think Carl and Randall sort of kind of already hinted at this, but sort of as you're kind of navigating the system, as you hear the presentations today, as you're meeting with people, take the time to say, oh, this is one I want to double click on over the next few weeks. Because this program over here, I can see how we could add value, and that could bring something back to our organization. Right? One way of thinking about that is there really was, the best line I've heard about this, I'm not sure that there was a recipe, but there was a pattern. There was a set of things that occurred again and again on a rhythmic basis that let us see this ecosystem evolve. You're going to be hearing from Tim Rowe a little bit later. I think, right, he's your keynote kind of closer for today. I just think the initiative that he brought, basically, and I'm going to show you a little visual in just a few minutes, kind of, right, saying, where could startups go where they wouldn't have to rent an office and have big equipment and kind of big liability, where they could have very fractional time, that they could start with a 2-person, just share a desk, then they move to 4-person, 5-person. Once they get into an office, then there's another layer, and the whole idea is to kind of ultimately kick people out of the building. It's kind of a really cool idea, and you're going to hear more about that from Tim later. I will say, I've always thought, Tim is a wonderful colleague and a real leader within this ecosystem. His mother, Mary Rowe, which is incredible, she's now emeritus, was just wonderful MIT faculty member, and really somebody who created very deep connections across campus, across multiple generations, during a big period of growth and also challenge for MIT. And she was one of the people who sort of overcame individually some of those challenges. So there's kind of a personal element there. And what you see, and you're going to see some of this, whether or not it's Mass Challenge, whether or not it's the Startup Exchange, you will see these different stakeholder approaches. In other words, very often, entrepreneurs, their job is to build their companies. Their job is not ecosystem development, is not ecosystem engagement. That's something that they do because they need to if they can be helped. And so therefore, it's our job to help them. Okay? Let me be clear. And that ultimately helps us. Right, let me just finish that sentence. Right? And so whether or not you see that, right, you see these different kinds of initiatives over time. Physically, once again, I love Kendall Square, but we are part of a broader ecosystem, and I think you should sort of kind of take the time to kind of walk around the streets. And the great thing is that, there's this other university called Harvard. You might have heard of it. It's an arts and crafts school down the road. No, that's not true. Okay, right? But, is walking distance. There are very few places like that, right? Maybe Tsinghua, Peking, and things like that, right? And all of that allows, all these different programs and initiatives, allow us to see the kind of arc that can be created. This is from a student perspective. This is how we arc our students through various initiatives and programs from MIT, from idea to ultimately escape velocity, okay? And this over here is my very valued colleague, Bill Aulett, the managing director of the MIT Trust Center for Entrepreneurship, of whom I am the faculty director, right? And Bill has been this enormously good force for sort of bringing together this ecosystem in a very student-facing way and kind of impacting, kind of really giving kind of the ability to sort of knit together that process. Bunch of other programs here. We'll make these slides available. One thing I should mention here is the Engine, which was an important startup spin-off from MIT that is both a financial as well as a physical space that really is trying to overcome the capital problem, the risk capital problem that many of our most difficult technologies face here, because the traditional VC model didn't work. It's too short term. Wasn't enough commitment, wasn't enough scale. Just this morning, one of the companies, a little bit of a special company, within the Engine portfolio, Commonwealth Fusion announced its $1.6 billion fundraise. That's its Series B round. If you think a Series B is $1.6 billion, that's right. They either have Fusion or not. It's one of the most exciting things that's happening on this campus right now. Really a game changer. Okay? Here's IHQ just across the street. You should definitely take time to visit that. That's been a real change in terms of kind of giving a physical location for some of these kind of innovation headquarters around campus. Okay, and then we see that all of those activities together then lead entrepreneurs themselves to become engaged, to contribute back to the ecosystem, and that creates this thing. Do I have like 3 minutes? Okay, look at that. I'm way ahead of schedule. Not really. Okay, and so this is once again, kind of there's too many logos up here, and the purpose is to confuse you, but also to give you a sense that there are many entry points. There are lots of different programs, different activities. I was once asked by our provost, who actually was a little mad at me, to tell him how many entrepreneurship courses we taught at MIT. I actually asked Fiona, and she told me to figure it out. So I did that very dutifully, right? I like to count things, quantitative person. And I tried to go around, and instead I actually came up with a proof that there are an infinite number of courses on entrepreneurship at MIT. It was by induction. No matter how many courses I found, there was at least one course because I taught one. No matter how many courses I found, there was always one more. And so by induction, there are an infinite number of courses. That's kind of a little high school math joke there, guys. Okay, we'll keep on going. Okay. One last part I'd say. Simply showing up is not enough. One really great contributor to our ecosystem, and really deliberate, has been the Microsoft New England Research and Development Group. I will say I was affiliated with them for a few years on some projects. I can't remember, I was an associate or something. But there's, both pre-COVID, but even during COVID, they've just been an enormous convener of activities within the ecosystem. They sort of are willing to spill over a bunch of their knowledge, invite postdocs in, help people with projects, provide even equipment for people in a kind of very good way. I will say one of the big disappointments, I'm a big fan of this company. I love Disney as a company, as I teach strategy, as from a kind of broad corporate. But when Disney showed up, I think it was about 15 years ago, they sort of got this little office, and their idea was that they would just do they were going to look and take advantage of MIT. That was kind of almost their explicit strategy. And they've had one or two interesting little research projects they've done with individual faculty, and I assume those are very productive. But they're really not a member of this ecosystem. You probably didn't even know they were here. You probably didn't, right? And they paid their high rent. They got a little bit done, but I'm not sure it paid off. And once again, that's a really good company that overall, outside of the ecosystem, has done many good things around innovation, around engagement, but somehow they kind of showed up and it just wasn't enough to move the dial. And that's a big company like Disney. And so sort of think about that. Lastly, I'll kind of end up here with it's really useful to say, okay, I got it, Scott, Carl, we get it. It's really interesting. But kind of what does this really mean? Can we really visualize, can we sort of see the impact of this in terms of what that ecosystem really is? There was a project that came out of, at the top of this is Jorge Guzman. Jorge was a doctoral student at Sloan a number of years ago. He's now at Columbia University. And in his dissertation, he came up with kind of a new method of thinking about both the visualization, the measurement and the visualization and the quantification of entrepreneurial ecosystems at scale. And we have a very large set of projects around this. I'll focus pretty narrowly here. He realized that all businesses that ultimately scale are registered. That was actually a good insight. And that we could see things about those businesses very early on in terms of their growth potential, their quality. very kind of prediction. Think of this as just predictive model, not at all causal. And then, of course, the firms that actually succeed, of course, you know in Amazon because it's a big company, and that gives you an opportunity to basically model sort of the growth of the company as a function of those kind of startup characteristics against the full population of firms. There's some interesting things here. This is against all firms in the United States. This is, remember, not causal. If you name your firm after the founder, if you're Scott's Pizza, you're probably some dude named Scott selling pizza, and that's also part of our entrepreneurial ecosystem. I recommend Dimitrio's Pizza out in Cambridgeport, where I live, just a few less than a mile away. Interestingly, those companies that literally just did simple things like obtaining intellectual property or filing for it within 6 months after founding and registering in Delaware, showing their openness to kind of growth, right? Remember, this is just a prediction, are literally 8,300% more likely to grow. And that's given us lots of insight for understanding entrepreneurial quality and quantity. And if you could just play this. Great. And so what we've done is this is literally where you are, starting back in the 1980s, and you can, right? And so over here, I'm going to try to find my clicker, but you can sort of see on the top left, the white dots, so the size of the dots are the number of firms in each little street location. The color of the dots is their average growth potential within that location within that year. On the top left, that's kind of what's called Central Square, right? That's where our students go and drink and have, where there's some accountants and there's, some shawarma and whatever. I highly recommend that. Over here on the right, that is Kendall Square. And that big orange dot, that is in fact the Cambridge Innovation Center, the location of the Cambridge Innovation Center, basically the densest, within the United States, the densest single building in terms of entrepreneurial quality in the world. Okay, great. So let me just kind of finish up. I have 30 seconds or 0 seconds?
Well, we want to do some questions.
Okay, perfect, okay. Right, does only take 10 seconds. Just the key message that I would hold for you is to remember the role of stakeholders. What role do I play in contributing to the ecosystem? What value do I bring? And what role do other stakeholders play in realizing that value? Thank you guys so much. I'm looking forward to any questions and comments. Great.
So we have a few questions here. Where is it most critical to create value within the ecosystem?
4 votes. Very excellent. I like that. Great question. So it depends on who you are. Ecosystems, so we actually had a student, Dan Fader, a PhD student now at USC, who actually studied this in some detail. And you might think, oh, if an ecosystem gets one good thing, then everything else is less important. Basically everything is, different assets and different initiatives are sort of substitutes. Another view is that ecosystems are rocket ships. The more boosters you have, the higher you go. And he actually looked at that in detail, actually using data from Mass Challenge, so an accelerator near here. And what he found was very strong evidence for complementarity. So the more different places that an ecosystem operates, the better off is, the more that people are able to engage in more things, the better off those companies are, okay? And I think that is as true from the perspective, and I would defer to my colleague Phil Button here, who I think is a lot more about this than I have, but I think that the evidence is that that is as true for a corporate stakeholder. And what you want to find is the place where your organization can kind of have an anchor. What are the 3 or 4 events per year that you sort of shape? What are the ways that people, that people know when somebody, a student comes to them and says, I need, help with X, and people think, oh, I was just meeting with the vice president of R&D of company, right, company Z, and they said they have this great data set that exactly addresses that. And we can work with them collaboratively, and you get a PhD out of it, and the company gets a great project out of it. Do you see what I'm saying? And so be on the lookout for those areas of mutual complementarity that relate to your comparative advantage, and that can drive your competitive advantage.
We have another question, and this is very interesting. Can you speak to allocation of R&D spend as it relates to investing in an external ecosystem?
Absolutely. I've thought about this. So increasingly, the success of your own the same point of complementarity. There is very good evidence now for more than 20 years that companies that invest in a strategy that mixes a strong internal innovation capacity through often formal R&D, but also other problem solving, and then complements that with a robust portfolio approach of other innovation engagements. You don't have to have everything on the platter, but sort of, both alliances, engaging in certain kinds of networks, identifying areas where maybe your contributions to open innovation are particularly prominent. The more you're able to sort of develop the organizational capacity to do both of those things at the same time, the better. I think for many companies, they find that turns out at a quantitative level, sort of think about it kind of $1 in $6 of 1 in 6 units of effort. That's probably a better way to think about it than dollars. 1 in 6 hours of people effort is being devoted to that external facing. That might be even a little low, but is kind of where I think some people in the literature are.
And we have just 1 minute. Does regional imply only Kendall Square, or wherever MIT alumni are pursuing entrepreneurial endeavors?
So I'm very much a location matters kind of person, and that makes, so in the context, I think I would make 2 layers there. First, we live in a very global world. Obviously, the pandemic has made it even more, given us more of an ability to access networks on a global basis. With that said, there really is something that's really special about repeated interactions among people within a regional location, within Kendall Square or maybe a bit broader. There's a student that just graduated last year, Christian Figueroa, who's a supervisor his dissertation, who really looked at that micro interaction among researchers literally within leading ecosystems. That having been said, and I think the Startup Exchange has been great in this, is many of the companies in the Startup Exchange are Kendall Square, but not all of them, right? Right, because I know some of them are external. MIT is a forum and a convener and a pathway to a very broad community. And it may make sense to layer some of your efforts on thinking about that extra layer that's beyond the region, that's beyond our location, and is really kind of also tapping into that broader social network.
Well, thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
Professor Stern.
Good seeing you.
That was great. Here,